If you've seen the 1964 film Zulu, you'll probably remember when a colonial officer, Lieutenant Adendorff, rides into Rorke's Drift with the terrible news that the British army has been wiped out by the Zulus at Isandlwana. According to the film, he then stood and fought at Rorke's Drift, a battle where a British garrison of less than 150 men fought off an attack by 4,000 Zulu warriors. But whilst Lieutenant Adendorff definitely brought that news, and a warning that the Zulus were on their way, according to one of the most famous books on the war, The Washing of the Spears, written by Donald R. Morris, he actually fled before any fighting started. So, was Lieutenant Gert Adendorff the man who fled 2 battles on the same day? Or was he the only man to survive both the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift? Stay with me as we uncover the truth about a man caught between battlefield legend and historical suspicion. A mystery fuelled by conflicting accounts, missing records, and a court-martial that never happened. The name Gert Adendorff doesn't get many mentions in books about the Anglo-Zulu War, but for those of you who've watched the epic film Zulu, and I know there are a few of you out there, you will recognise the character played by South African actor Gert van der Burg. In the 1964 film, Adendorff appears riding in from Isandlwana with the terrible news of that British defeat, the worst defeat the British army ever suffered at the hands of an African army. Now, I've told the story of the Battle of Isandlwana in a previous episode, so if you want to find out more, please check it out. When Lieutenant Bromhead, played by Michael Caine, claims that it's impossible that 800 men have been wiped out, Adendorff corrects him, pointing out that a further 400 African levies, members of the Natal Native Corps, had also been killed. It leads to a now famous exchange when Bromhead says, "Damn the levies, man, more cowardly blacks." And Adendorff snaps back, "What the hell do you mean, cowardly blacks? They died on your side, didn't they? And who the hell do you think's coming to wipe out your little command? The Grenadier Guards?" From the very start, Adendorff plays a pivotal role in the film's structure. He isn't just that messenger, he provides a cultural insight to the Zulus. Both to the British officers and to the audience, he explains Zulu military tactics, like the deadly Horns of the Buffalo formation. When Bromhead casually dismisses that fighting tactic as jolly simple, Adendorff corrects him, "It's jolly deadly, old boy." And then comes a crucial moment. Lieutenant Chard, played by Stanley Baker, asks him if he intends to stay. Adendorff turns away and says, "Is there anywhere else to go?" The film Zulu cemented Adendorff in popular memory as a knowledgeable and principled man, but it also quietly echoed the mystery that surrounds him. Present in key scenes explaining Zulu tactics and thinking, we never actually see him do any fighting. And that mirrors an accusation that was raised at the time, and subsequently too. Did he really stay and fight, or did he flee? Gert Wilhelm Adendorff was born in 1848 in Graaf Reinet, a town in the eastern interior of the British Cape Colony. The Adendorff family were of German origin, believed to have emigrated to the Cape in the 1790s. Even in 1879, despite living in the British Cape Colony, his English wasn't particularly good. By the late 1870s, Gert had signed up as a volunteer in the 9th Frontier War, a bloody conflict between the British and the Quazzers. It was a tough, irregular campaign that exposed many volunteers to guerrilla warfare. It also saw the British Regular Army participate, including the 24th Regiment of Foot, whose B Company 2nd Battalion were the main garrison at Rorke's Drift a few years later. When that war ended, Adendorff stayed on. He joined the 3rd Regiment of the Natal Native Contingent, known as the NNC, a colonial auxiliary unit formed to support the British Army in the looming war with the Zulus. The NNC were made up largely of African recruits, with white officers drawn from colonial volunteers. Poorly trained, badly armed, and often given little respect by their British counterparts, the NNC would later be both scapegoated and overlooked. Adendorff held the officer rank of lieutenant, and it was in this capacity that he was assigned to No. 6 Company under Captain Crone in the lead-up to the Zulu campaign. On the morning of the 22nd of January, 1879, the British Central Column was encamped beneath the rocky outcrop of Isandlwana in Zululand. Lord Chelmsford had departed earlier that day with half his force, searching for the main Zulu army, which he believed was gathering to the east. Among the roughly 1,800 men left behind were regular infantry from the 24th Regiment, colonial volunteers, artillerymen, and African auxiliaries, including Gert Adendorff's unit, No. 6 Company of the 3rd Regiment, Natal Native Contingent. Early that morning, Adendorff was sent to the forward pickets to confirm sightings of Zulu activity on the surrounding hills. His report back at the camp was vague, possibly due to those language difficulties, so Lieutenant Higginson was sent to verify it. By the time Higginson returned, the camp was already preparing for battle. The Zulu army, some 20,000 strong, had arrived, and within hours they would overwhelm the British camp. Crone's company, where Adendorff was stationed, were held in reserve. Now, whether they were deliberately held back or simply overlooked remains unclear. But as the Zulu horns closed around the camp, the 24th Foot began a fighting retreat, and the NNC broke and fled. Higginson, who would survive the battle, crossing the Buffalo River with Lieutenants Melville and Coghill, who were attempting to save the colours of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment, later wrote, "When my company saw them coming on, nothing could stop them. All the mounted men were riding past as fast as they could, and I thought it time to go too." So too, it seems, did Adendorff. The question is, when did he flee, and how? Some, like Donald Morris, claimed Adendorff must have left very early in the battle, in fact before the British position had even given way, implying cowardice. This hinges on Adendorff's own garbled conversation with Chard when he stated that he had escaped along the road or track running back to Rorke's Drift, 8 miles from the camp. If that is the case, Morris argued, then he could only have done so before the 2 Zulu horns joined up to encircle the camp. In other words, he'd left very early on. Because whilst the horns didn't join up until almost the end of the battle, the presence of large numbers of Zulus on the track back to Rorke's Drift forced later fugitives to head across country, trying to reach a crossing more than 5 miles downstream from Rorke's Drift itself. Others have argued, however, that he could have ridden with the other fugitives to the Buffalo River and then, rather than trying to cross in the bloody mayhem at Fugitives' Drift, had hugged the riverbank, heading upstream back towards Rorke's Drift. He certainly met another survivor somewhere along the riverbank, Lieutenant Vane. Crucially, Vane never actually mentioned how Adendorff had arrived at that spot, but did claim that he'd ridden in from his right. But that doesn't really mean a lot in the confused and terrifying flight from Isandlwana. And as Vane also claimed that he'd left the camp as it started to fall, the fact that Adendorff then joined him at the river would make it difficult to square with the latter accusations that he'd left a lot earlier. But it's not impossible. Nevertheless, no matter how and when he'd left Isandlwana, Adendorff was now definitely heading to Rorke's Drift with his comrade. At approximately 3:15 p.m, Lieutenant John Chard was working near the Buffalo River, building a pontoon, when he saw 2 horsemen galloping towards him from the direction of Isandlwana. They were Lieutenants Adendorff and Vane. Chard recalled, quote, "One of them, Lieutenant Adendorff, jumped off his horse, took me aside, and told me the camp was in the hands of the Zulus and the army destroyed. I'm afraid I did not quite believe him." Unquote. But Adendorff described the disaster in such vivid detail that Chard became convinced. He immediately dispatched both men to the nearby mission station, Rorke's Drift, to warn Lieutenant Bromhead and the small garrison, principally comprising B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot. Vane then rode on to raise the alarm at another tiny outpost at Helpermarker, a few miles inland. However, as Adendorff rode off towards Bromhead, he called back to Chard, "I will remain and help in the defence." And this is where the story becomes murky. Many survivors of Rorke's Drift later wrote about the battle, but few mentioned Adendorff. So, was he really there? Part of the answer lies in the confusion of battle, timing, and an influencer. For a start, Adendorff, who had only just arrived, had no connections with the 24th Foot, so no one knew or probably cared who he was, and the fact that he didn't speak English as his first tongue probably didn't help any hurried integration. The fact he was stuck in the storehouse, effectively fighting on his own, would have kept him out of sight of most of the defenders, and as the battle was principally fought through the night, he was almost invisible. As no one knew him, no one was asking where he was or how he was getting on, so easy for fellow defenders positioned elsewhere in the mission station that night not to mention him in their later recollections. And finally, there was the influencer, Donald R. Morris. In his 1965 book, The Washing of the Spears, Morris wrote, quote, "My suspicion that Adendorff did not stay to aid the defence is based on analysis of all the sources. Space precludes a review of all the evidence, which I hope to publish separately." But he never did. What most people don't realise is that Morris conducted most of his research remotely, whilst posted in Berlin as a CIA officer. He was actually in the city when the Berlin Wall was constructed. Hence, to write his iconic book, Morris relied on correspondence with archives far away in Britain and South Africa. He had limited access to South African sources, oral histories, or obscure colonial records that have since come to light. And yet, as Washing of the Spears has sold well over 200,000 copies, and is for many interested in the war and fans of the film the only book they've read, his views on Adendorff's role, or lack thereof, in the battle carry weight. However, we do have several sources that tell a different story, that rather like in the film, he really did stay and fight. Lieutenant John Chard, who commanded the defence, wrote in his official report to Queen Victoria, quote, "As far as I know, but one of the fugitives remained with us, Lieutenant Adendorff. From a loophole in the store building, flanking the wall and the hospital, his rifle did good service." Private Henry Hook VC echoed this. "The lieutenant stayed behind with us." Trooper Fred Simmons, who arrived the next morning with Chelmsford's relief column, recalled being told about a foreigner in the storehouse who shot a Zulu trying to set fire to the building. While this act is sometimes credited to Corporal Francis Atwood, who was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, Simmons insisted that it was a foreigner, and apart from the Swiss-born Corporal Schiess, who was on the barricades, the only likely candidate was Adendorff. And there's more. Captain Charles Harford of the Natal Native Contingent, an officer well known for his meticulous note-keeping, compiled an almanac of all the Rorke defenders following the war. In it, he listed Gert Adendorff as one of the men present at the battle. He even recorded the names and location of Adendorff's next of kin. That suggests not just hearsay, but personal contact. And then there was Charles Norris Newman, a journalist and war correspondent who had accompanied Chelmsford's invasion. He knew many of the officers personally, and in his published list of those who fought at Rorke's Drift, he too included Adendorff. Meanwhile, Captain Walter Stafford, writing in 1939, 60 years after the event, confirmed that he had spoken to Adendorff in person in 1883 and heard detailed recollections of the battle. "He told me the Zulus retired in the middle of the night, giving the garrison time to strengthen the fort, and that the fire lit the field for our volleys." Stafford also recalled Adendorff's comment about Reverend George Smith, urging a swearing soldier to stop cursing. "Please, my good man, stop that cussing. We may shortly have to answer for our sins." To which the man replied, "All right, mister, you do the praying and I'll send the black beebs to hell as fast as I can." So was Adendorff simply a Walter Mitty character telling a fabricated story? Historian Ian Knight doubts it. How could Adendorff have slipped away from Rorke's Drift after delivering his message, and then have fabricated such accurate details about the fighting? The lighting of the thatch roof, the Zulu lull in the night, even the banter with Reverend Smith. Those were details no outsider could have known unless they'd been there. When taken together, the weight of the evidence supporting Adendorff as a defender of Rorke's Drift is substantial. What is interesting is how Adendorff came to be singled out for the suspicion that he fled 2 battles in a day, because he wasn't the only white soldier to flee Isandlwana. 55 Europeans, all mounted, managed to escape the carnage. And unlike colonials such as Adendorff, 5 of them were actually regular British officers. In other words, professional soldiers of Queen Victoria, drawn from the top stratas of British society. Officers and gentlemen. They were Captain Alan Gardner, Captain Edward Essex, and Lieutenants Cochrane, Curling and Smith-Dorrien. And consider this. None of those 5 officers, having crossed the Buffalo River, bothered to ride to Rorke's Drift to warn the garrison of British redcoats from their own army of the danger. Admittedly, Captain Essex did send a warning scribbled on a note, which Bromhead received at almost the same time Adendorff was briefing Chard down at the Drift. But Essex had sent it with a mounted African soldier. Meanwhile, he and the others, all travelling separately, headed to Helpermarka, further into the colony. Even if Adendorff, having warned Chard, had ridden off, would his actions have been any worse than those Imperial officers? And yet, it was Adendorff's reputation that would be threatened with a court-martial. In the days and weeks following the twin battles of Isandlwana and Rorke, emotions ran high in Lord Chelmsford's army and in the Natal colony. Shock, anger and the need for explanations led to scapegoating and to scrutiny of those who'd survived. Among those caught in the net were Lieutenants Gert Adendorff and Vane. They were arrested in Pietermaritzburg and ordered to face a court-martial for desertion in the face of the enemy. But the trial never happened. Why? The most likely reason is the inconvenient truth of Lieutenant Chard's reports. In his correspondence with Queen Victoria and in his official military dispatch, Chard had made it clear that Lieutenant Adendorff remained to assist in the defence, and from a loophole in the store building, his rifle did good service. To court-martial Adendorff would have meant questioning Chard's testimony. Testimony already sent to the monarch and included in the official record of the battle. Had Chard been called to testify and stood by his account, the prosecution would have embarrassingly crumbled. Yet, had he retracted it, the credibility of his entire report, including the heroics of Rorke's Drift and all the Victoria Crosses that came from it, would have been undermined. For the British Army, already reeling from the disaster at Isandlwana and eager to preserve the legend of Rorke's Drift, a court-martial was an unwelcome complication. Better perhaps to let the matter quietly fade away. And so it did. Adendorff was not tried, but his name was not cleared, nor was it condemned. Instead, he slipped into the shadows of history, neither celebrated nor officially disgraced. But doubts lingered. Doubts that were never levelled at those imperial officers. Captain Edward Essex, rather than facing a court-martial, would go on to become a colonel in the Gordon Highlanders. A friend of H. Rider Haggard, author of King Solomon's Mines, he was one of the very last survivors of Isandlwana to die in 1939. Captain Alan Gardner, a graduate of Staff College and on secondment from the prestigious Hussars, would go on to fight at the battles of Hlaban and Kambula in this war, before being appointed aide-de-camp to the Viceroy of Ireland. Gardner rose to the rank of colonel and became a Member of Parliament. He died in 1907. Lieutenant Cochrane also continued to serve in the Zulu War, being present at the final battle at Ulundi. His long military career included being a brigade commander in the Dongola expedition in Sudan in 1896. He died in London in 1927. Lieutenant Curling, the only one of the men to have actually fought on the front line at Isandlwana, would soon be promoted to captain. He ended his military career as a lieutenant colonel in Egypt and passed away in 1910. Finally, 20-year-old Lieutenant Horace Smith-Dorrien would have the most illustrious military career of them all. He would command 2 corps at the Battle of Mons in 1914. General Smith-Dorrien died in 1930. Seeing as all those professional soldiers' careers didn't seem to suffer at all, it begs the question why Adendorff was threatened with a court-martial. Were the authorities trying to find scapegoats for their defeat at Isandlwana? Rather than suggesting that Queen Victoria's redcoats, including their commander, Lord Chelmsford, had been outthought or outfought by the Zulus, maybe some wanted to explain away the defeat by finding a scapegoat in the British Army. But interestingly, when blame was laid within the British Army, it wasn't at the doors of the infantry. Instead, fingers were pointed at overzealous quartermasters limiting the supply of ammunition, and Royal Engineer and Colonial Officer Colonel Durnford. The low opinion that many regular officers and troops already had of the NNC was reinforced by the stories of their breaking at Isandlwana. Maybe, some argued, if they'd stood and fought, the camp would have been saved. So maybe Adendorff was simply caught up in all that mix. Whilst the court-martial never materialised, the stigma of being the only man to desert 2 battles on that day in January 1879 never quite went away. But here's another perspective. Maybe he was the only man to survive being present at both the battles of Isandlwana and then Rorke's Drift. And he lived to tell the tale. OK, he wasn't on the front line at Isandlwana, but that was because his unit were held back, and then they broke as the Zulus swarmed into the camp. As a survivor, he obviously did flee the camp, but then others did too. And despite the fact that none of the British regular officers, unlike volunteer Adendorff, bothered to ride and warn the garrison at Rorke's Drift, they all went on to enjoy long careers in the British Army. If you believe Chard, Henry Hook and others, he was present at Rorke's Drift. However, this recently arrived foreigner was stuck in the storehouse, pretty much out of sight and out of mind. He was almost an invisible defender who, never in the running for a Victoria Cross, simply disappeared from the story. Near the very end of the film Zulu, after a battle that had lasted the best part of 12 hours through the night, he joins the two officers in the burned out remains of the hospital. At the same time, Colour Sergeant Bourne, played by Nigel Green, is taking a roll call, where there are some great light-hearted lines between the men and the NCO. Suddenly, the Zulu army once more appears on the skyline and starts to sing. And whilst Bromhead thinks they're mocking the tiny garrison, Adendorff corrects him. They are, he said, saluting fellow braves. The Zulus then drift off over the hill. In many ways, that simple disappearance is a reflection of the real Gert Adendorff. He simply drifts off the pages of history. Upon the disbandment of the NNC after the debacle at Isandlwana, Adendorff drifted back into civilian life and obscurity. He ended up in the Transvaal, where he stayed during the Boer War, never joining the Boers, but never actively supporting the British either. He died there in 1914. Which simply leaves us with the question, did Gert Adendorff desert 2 battles in a day? Or was he, having ridden to warn the mission station, the only man to survive both the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift? I'll leave you to decide. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story about the character from the film Zulu, who most people don't know much about. Plenty more stories about the Anglo-Zulu War on my channel, including a look at how historically accurate the film Zulu actually was, and also a poignant episode about what happened to those Victoria Cross heroes after Rorke's Drift. I've posted links in the description. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I hope to see you again very soon with more stories from British history.